Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that you will find informative, enlightening, and insightful. And of course, if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I hope that today's episode is one that you will once again find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So, before we get into this podcast and reveal our new guest, let's go over the housekeeping. So, as always, if you're on YouTube, make sure you hit the red subscribe button so you can get future notifications of new episodes on the Identity Talk channel. And that includes new episodes of our newest podcast, Radical Math Talk, which is all about the revolutionaries in math education. And also, if you are someone who wants to give a donation to help us continue to build the platform, we do accept donations on both Cash App and Venmo. So if you are on Cash App, you want to follow us with the handle # IDTALK4ED. And if you are on the Venmo, the handle will be at KWAMESM. So that's Kwame SM. Any donations, small or big, are welcome. And we appreciate those who have been following us from day 1, from day 10, day 15. Whenever you started watching this podcast or listening to it, we appreciate the support and we thank you kindly. So we are now at the main event. And this is episode, I believe, 115, if I'm not mistaken. So we are 115 episodes in, which is a remarkable achievement given all the ups and downs we've had with this podcast, all the traveling I've been doing personally, going from one country to the next, being in a new country 1 week and then another country 2 weeks later. And it's just been an awesome journey, and this journey is going to continue to be awesome because today's guest is awesome, and we're going to be having an incredible conversation about identity, which is the very essence of what we do on this podcast. So I'm glad to have somebody who is a phenomenal educator, who's like-minded, and just as passionate about fostering a sense of identity, not just in our young people, but also in the teachers who are teaching those young people. And we're gonna get into a great conversation about everything from that to the importance of character development in our classrooms and how that has to serve as the foundation for whatever comes academically and everything else. If you don't have strong character, you can't achieve academically. So that has to happen before all the other things take place. But we're going to get deeper into that though. But without further ado, let me bring on Rebekah Macden to the podcast to talk to us about her work with fostering identity in young people, and also just her journey in education, which I believe is a fascinating one. And I know that you all will enjoy her story when she shares it. So let's go ahead and bring Rebekah on. Hello.
Hello. So good
How
to
are
be
you
here.
doing?
I'm
Yes.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. How are you, Kwame?
Listen, Rebekah, I can't complain. It's always great to be in conversation with another great educator who's doing transformative work. So whenever I get the opportunity to do that every week, it always lights me up. So thank you for contributing to that.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor. I've listened to your podcast for a while since we connected several months ago,
Yes.
and um, I'm just it's an honor to be here. You're doing incredible work. I'm inspired by the work that you do, the educator that you are. And so it's an honor to be here on the podcast and also just to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you so much. The feeling is definitely mutual. And I am ready to get started because you have such a fascinating story. And here on this podcast, and as you know how important it is to share about identity, a huge part of our identity is our story.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a story that led us into this path that we call education. So I want to give you the opportunity to share your story and what ultimately brought you into this wonderful field that we all do.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to even say that my story began before I was born, because I know we both we hold such strong value to our backgrounds, to the journeys that our ancestors have gone through. And so actually for me, in my family, on both sides of the family, we have educators, teachers, principals, founders of schools. So I'm really honored. I'm privileged to carry on the legacy of education. But to be totally honest, in the beginning, I didn't know that I wanted to go into education. Growing up, I always had a heart and a passion for children. Even when I was a kid, I always wanted to, be some sort of support or guidance to other kids. But then going throughout middle school, high school, I was just kind of known as the singer. So I'm a musician, a singer. That was my identity, I guess. And so I didn't really know who I was, in total honesty. I found a lot of my identity in what other people said about me, what they believed that I was going to become. I looked up to other siblings, and I was like, well, I'm going to do that because that's what that sibling did. And so for me, I decided I'm going to major in music because that's just what everyone around me had told me, like, whoa, you're going to do music then, right? And it wasn't until I was in college, I started working at a music school, and just my love for working with the kids was so strong. I was like, I love working with the kids. And eventually, long story short, it evolved into realizing that what I really wanted to do, my heart was really just pouring into kids, and working with them, shaping them. And so I changed my major, my junior year of college. I changed from music to elementary education. And that's kind of where it started, with my heart and the work behind what I do there. So,
Right.
that's the short story of how I got into education.
Okay.
Yeah.
So fascinating. So you were a musician. What instrument did you play?
Well, I should actually, as soon as I said that, I was like, I need to be careful when I say that because musician meaning with my voice. So I do play around with the piano and the guitar, but definitely not where I would call myself like a player of those instruments. But I'm a singer. So I was majoring in vocal education, and that was my thing until I realized, like, I love it. And I still love that. And I bring music into whatever I do. It's a huge part of my life. It's a part of my family. We're all musicians and singers. But my real passion, it was teaching. It was education and working one-on-one with kids and, in the classroom. So, yeah.
All right. Awesome.
If you need a singer later, I can sing.
You don't have to tell me twice. That's already in my mind. So I don't know. Are you soprano, alto, tenor? What's your range?
I would say probably more so in the alto range, but like I said, my family is a huge family, and we're all singers, and so I'm the sixth of 7 kids. So by the time it came to me, it was like, pick whatever harmony part you can find. So my comfortable range is probably, I would say, alto, but I will pull out the soprano and the tenor and the bass, whatever part is missing to sing.
I
So
hear that. Okay.
to me, the music that comes from the soul, that's the most important thing.
Yes, it is for sure. So both of us grew up as first generation immigrants. in America. And whenever you have that label, there comes some challenges while you're growing up. I know I faced them when I was in school, and I would assume that you probably faced some challenges yourself. So I want to know from you, during your childhood, what were some of the challenges and struggles that you faced as far as embracing your cultural identity and being able to be your authentic self in the different spaces you're occupying?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, growing up as a first generation immigrant, I was actually the first one in our family to be born in the US. I have five older siblings, and they, as well as my parents, were born in India, grew up in India. My family immigrated to the States in the 70s, and then I was the first one born um, in the US. And so I feel like it really shaped me in a very unique way because I was the first one to really grow up in this other culture that what for me was very, it was very real. Like I started kindergarten in the US. My whole life was in the US besides, going back to visit India. And so in a you know, in a lot of ways I didn't really ever identify as Indian, even though culturally, my family was Indian, we'd go back and visit, but um, and I'm sure you could probably relate. Growing up, I didn't really think too much about what my cultural identity, but I just, growing up, I felt as normal, as similar to the other kids as anyone else. Um, but then it was probably around middle school that I really started to feel and be told that I was different. And it was something that it was confusing. It was sometimes really disheartening because it would be brought up in times when someone was trying to tell me I wasn't enough, um, in groups of friends or whatever. And it was the first time that I realized, like I'm seen as Indian, but I very much feel just like any of the other kids. I'm an American kid growing up in the U.S., born here. I speak English. I actually didn't grow up learning my home, our cultural language in India. And so it was a bit of a struggle in that sense that I felt very different, but then I didn't fully understand what it was that I could do differently. At that age, you just really want to be accepted and you want to be seen as just like everyone else. And so I would say that was probably the first time I really started to realize that there was something different. And at the time, I didn't realize what a beautiful, beautiful gift it was. I think if anything, I just wanted to hide and shy away from my cultural identity as an Indian because I didn't want it to separate me from the rest. And so I think early on, I really learned to, unfortunately, find ways as much as possible, find ways to just kind of blend. I talk about using the power of our voices. And I think early on, I learned how to just blend in with the choir instead of ever using my voice in its own unique way. And so I would find ways to either blend in or just completely silence myself to dim down who I was, just because I really, really wanted to be as American as the other kids, but then at the same time at home, I wanted to be as Indian. And so I think that was the beginning of that initial struggle. You know what I'm saying? Of just,
No, I hear you.
yeah.
I hear you. Because there's a lot of parallels between how you were growing up and how I grew up. And I remember being in elementary school, knowing that my parents came from Ghana. They spoke a different language, even though they also spoke English as well.
Hmm.
Uh, I knew that when I was at home, I was eating Ghanaian food. I was hearing my parents speaking, their native tongue, our native tongue. Um, and then when I would go to school, it was a totally different culture. I just blended in with the kids, just like you did. I played the same sports, played the same video games. There was really nothing different other than the fact that I was significantly darker than everybody else in the school, and I had a name that was non-English, so it stood out. But everything else was pretty much the same. So when you talk about just kind of living this double life, where when I was in school, my life was like this, but when I'm at home, my life is like this. Like it was even to the point where I'll be called a different name at home. I had like a home name and then I had a school name.
Wow. Yeah.
So like I would never have people call me by my home name at school. And then when I was at home, people didn't call me by my school name. So yes, when
Mhm.
I'm at school, I'm Kwame. But when I was at home, I was Nana Kakari.
Wow.
So Kakari is my middle name. But I only used it when I was at home because I just remember my mom and dad calling me Nana Kakari. So it just stuck with me.
Mhm.
I never understood the meaning behind that until I got older.
Yeah.
Um, but just to your point about language, I think the one thing that I wish I could change about my childhood was just the fact that I didn't get the opportunity to learn the language. I wish my parents had taught me the language. And maybe it's just because of how immigration was back then,
Yeah.
where English was such at a high premium, and it still is now, that they probably felt just to be able to navigate this new country, we need to make sure that all of our children can speak English so they could have
Yeah.
access to certain opportunities that we didn't have access to. So that's the only logical explanation I can think of for
Yeah.
not really being able to speak my language.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree with you. I think for me, that's one of the now I'm like, like I wish we had learned our language. I for the most, I feel like I understand most of it because I don't know if this happened with you, but at home a lot of times they would speak our language. We have two main languages that we speak, so Malayalam or Tamil. So they would speak the language, but we would often just respond in English, and um, and like to your point, I think it was well, we also grew up in a town where there were no other Indians, and there really wasn't a pressing need for us to speak the language. And
Right.
I don't know, I actually haven't asked my parents what their reasoning was, but I think it's probably the same. Just we're here in this country, we want the best, you know, opportunities for our children. Here they speak English. That's what we want to, even in India, English is held at a high value. It represents education, and so it's now that I'm at this point in my life, I'm like, man, like such a beautiful gift to be able to be, multilingual. Like both my parents, they each speak at least four languages, and as a kid, I just didn't. I didn't understand some of those beautiful gifts that we have as immigrant kids or first generation immigrant kids, that our parents are polyglots, that we have, I mean, the most incredible food with the most incredible spices, that, the most incredible like background of medical knowledge, and there's just so much that growing up, I'd be like, oh, like the food smells. Like, I don't want to bring that to school. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
weird. And now I'm realizing like just the wealth um, of history that I come from, and just how grateful I am for my parents who, your parents are immigrants as well. Like what they've gone through, the journeys and stories that they've had, and the faith and just the perseverance to not only
Yes.
come as immigrants, but then to also come with children and to raise kids in a completely different country and with all kinds of different cultural rules. And they were navigating a lot, and I just, as a kid, you don't realize those things. Like, you just kind of wonder, like, why aren't my parents like everyone else seems to be, you know but
Exactly.
it's an
Exactly.
incredible gift. I'm so grateful for the
For
background.
sure. Um, and I think it wasn't until I started to live abroad that I
Yep.
started to realize how fortunate I was to have the culture that I had, how important the language was.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're here in the States, you're speaking the same language as everybody else. Everybody's speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
But then the minute that you step out of the country to a totally different one, you now have to get acclimated to their culture,
Yep.
because you may be in situations or different nations where they're not going to be speaking English. There
Mm-hmm.
might be a small conglomerate of folks who speak it. And if they do, they may not speak it as fluently as they need to in order to be able to understand you, right?
Right. Yep.
So I'm wondering, when you ultimately made that transition to go abroad, right? And I think your first stop was it Brazil?
Yep. In
All
Brazil.
right.
Yep.
So when you moved to Brazil, first off, what motivated you to make that move? And then secondly, how did that transform not just your practice, but just your whole psyche?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, it's crazy, Kwame. Starting out, like when people see me today, I think, when they meet me today, I think they probably see this super confident woman who's lived in multiple countries around the world and embraces change like it's her best friend. Just speaker, international educator, author, all this stuff. But the truth is, it wasn't always that way at all. If you had met me even 10 years ago, I um, I used to be just crippled with anxiety about change. And I used to even tell people, like I have friends I could call up right now and they would tell you that I used to say I love structure and routines and procedures and just I wanted to know like the next step and what things were going to look like. And once had kind of carved out a particular lifestyle, I was good. And so I never really saw myself. We grew up traveling a lot. We went to many places around the world, but even then I was like, I'm someone who likes to stay planted in one place. And now I look at myself and I'm like, I can't believe that this is who I am. And so when you ask like what inspired me to even go, I would honestly say it was just being thrown into the I want to say like the fire of change. I had an opportunity to move to New York City. I think it was about 12 years ago now, and it just completely upset my whole um, plan of life. I had this perfect suburban life that I had going on living in Texas, and had this opportunity to move to New York. Took the opportunity, and then completely panicked and freaked out because I was like, I am not someone who likes change and likes big cities, and then it was honestly just call me like being thrown into it, and suddenly little by little realizing like more of who I was, and the layers of confidence that were deep within that I had never really um, tapped into because I had just covered it up with so much insecurity and just fear and need for things to stay the same so that I could predict the outcome. And I think honestly it was New York first, that whole experience of just realizing like I can't predict the outcome. And once I embraced that and realized like I can't predict the outcome, and I'm still going to be okay. And if I commit to growth, I'm going to see myself evolving into more of the kind of woman I want to be. It just really opened my eyes to like, oh my gosh, like what else is out there that I haven't even explored because I've been living in fear. And I would say my desire for living somewhere abroad was actually present since I was, a young kid, 14, 15 years old. It probably goes back to what we were talking about earlier as far as growing up as first generation immigrants. Um, around 14, 15 years old is when a lot of Mexicans had moved into our town. And this was the first time that anyone of color was around, that other kids of color were around me. And I didn't consciously think about this because I had wonderful friends who were white Americans in our town, but something just clicked when I started making friends with some of the new Mexican immigrants that had moved into town, and it just felt like there was a familiarity. Like we got each other, we understood each other's families, our backgrounds, our parents, and the multiple languages and different cultural, here at home and here at school kind of life that we were living. So I remember even back then, I was like, someday I want to live in Latin America. I want to live in Mexico. I would just that I felt such an affinity with the culture. Um, so fast forward to when I was living in New York, I met some other educators who had lived abroad, and I didn't know about the life. I was like, I'd heard about the Peace Corps or volunteering on mission trips and things like that, but I had no idea that there was even such a thing as international education. So they kind of opened my eyes to that. And I literally took the hugest step of faith. I resigned from my job. I signed up, through a program that kind of connects you with other international schools, quit my job in New York, and just without having a job lined up, I was like, okay, I'm doing this. I know, like, I just felt it in my heart. I was like, this is what I'm doing. And ended up getting a job in Brazil. And yeah, that began the whole journey of international education that I haven't been able to quit. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a lot.
Wow. But what's crazy is the irony of what you just said. So you just acknowledge the fact that you're someone that doesn't do well with transitions, constant change. I'm the same way. I'm someone that likes stability. I like to be stationary at one place for an extended period of time.
Uh-huh.
So then, when my family and I started to live abroad, and we saw how transient this lifestyle is, it was a learning curve for me. Because my wife, she's traveled to so many different places, so she's used to the constant transition. Being a former Peace Corps volunteer and having other international learning opportunities. This was something that wasn't a foreign concept for her.
Uh-huh.
But you just went ahead and just took a leap of faith. And, my therapist tells me that in order to change your mindset, you have to apply what she was calling cognitive behavioral therapy.
Uh-huh.
Ultimately, like this idea that you have to send your brain positive messages as a way to counter the negative ones that can creep into your mind.
Right.
Because we don't know that the negative is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like how we have imposter syndrome, when it comes to jumping to personal opportunities. It's the same thing when you're making a transition. We have these preconceived notions about what's happening, and then we scare ourselves out of not doing the opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I always say that I really believe that the things that we feel are our weaknesses really have an underlying strength that we maybe just haven't uncovered or tapped into yet. And so for me, now when I think about my identity, I'm like, I love change. I love, I think I embrace change. It actually freaks me out, the idea of being stagnant. And I don't mean necessarily like staying in one place physically. I just mean like, I learned that what was happening wasn't so much about the geographical location. It was like I used to be very like fixated on things have to stay the same because I'm too afraid of what happens internally when I can't predict the outcome. And
Right.
now I'm like, oh, when I can't predict the outcome, that's usually because I'm taking a step of faith to do something greater than what I feel comfortable with right now. I'm pushing the limits of my comfort zone. And that always signifies growth. And to me, I'm like, that's what life is. Like, if we're not growing, if we're not evolving, we're not stepping further out into, into to push our comfort zone a little further out, then we're not, I feel for me, I'm like, then I'm not growing. I'm not truly living life fully. If I'm never willing to sit with the uncomfortable beauty of change, because
Wow.
you learn so much about who you are when you are
Yes.
uncomfortable, when you're facing
Yes.
staring at, right in the face of fear or of uncertainty, when you're staring out into the middle of darkness, you're like, I don't know what's going to happen next. And then you really have to tap into, like, well, then who am I? Like, who am I? Am
Hmm.
I able to stand firm in my identity and who I am, not knowing like what's going on around me? What's the next step? It just solidifies you in a way that I think, it's just remarkable. To me, I'm like, that's life, you know. And so when you were talking about the experience of moving abroad, when I moved, my first international move was to Brazil, and I would say it was just life changing. To be in that, immediately you're just thrown into uncertainty and
Yeah.
uncomfortability, and not because it was an amazing experience, but it wasn't what I was used to. So new language, new culture, new ways of doing everything, banking, and just all the stuff that you're like, oh, I have to figure out all this stuff. I'm not just on a vacation. People a lot of times are like, oh, you live abroad, you just must hang out at the beach. And but no, you're like working, you're living, you're creating a life in a complete other country. And I think just the strength and the resilience that you learn in doing that, it was just quite honestly very life changing. You know.
Yes, it is. And what's amazing is that I sense that we're starting to segue into the work that that you ended up doing, which is why we're here, right? So you're looking at your upbringing, you're looking at the constant transitions you've made from, being in Texas in a small suburban town to moving to New York and then ultimately to Brazil. And then you stay abroad for a little bit. And during that time you're abroad, you start to make some connections between the self work you've been doing with your identity to how
Mhm.
it's connecting now to the work that you're doing directly with young people in the different international schools you worked in. So I'm interested in knowing, when was that? Was there a particular moment that you can remember where the light bulb just lit up and you just said, okay, this is the jackpot. We need to start talking about identity. This is
Yeah.
it right here.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was definitely a moment, but it was something that was building up inside of me for years. And like you said, it definitely has to do with my background, my heart for kids, my upbringing, the way our family looks at the world, and our purpose and our impact. And then it started just like with my experiences, as an educator. I worked in, Title I schools in the U.S., inner city schools. I worked with a few, like, as a one-on-one teacher for some families who were, quite wealthy, billionaires, who had access to all kinds of things. I worked with, then, I was working with kids in Brazil. I was working with kids in Belgium. Very different cultural, experiences there. And the thing that I just was that I saw that was consistent, no matter where I was, no matter the background of the students, the families that they came from, the languages that they spoke, the resources that they had available, no matter what, the thing that I noticed consistently was that all children still had this deep desire to be known, to be seen, to be loved, and to be valued. And that was just across the board. It didn't matter if there were certain kids that came from a more privileged background with more resources and access to opportunities. they still had this deep desire to be known, to be seen. And that's something that, you see, when you start seeing that, you're like, that this is something that you can't just say, well, these kids must have a better understanding of who they are because they have all of these resources, or these kids must be struggling with their identity because they, on paper, it looks like they don't have as much. What I saw is that what really mattered was what you were pouring into kids to really develop them emotionally, spiritually, mentally. Those are the things that outlasted any kind of other access to opportunities or privilege, And I'm not saying that those privileges and opportunities definitely don't make a difference in someone's life. But what I saw was that the core and the strength of a child and a human being really came down to what was being poured into them to build them up emotionally and spiritually, mentally. And so when I was in Brazil that first year, one of my close colleagues and friends, Nicole, she and I just would have these conversations about, man, it's crazy that as educators, we just really don't, of course we love our kids. There's a lot of emotional connection there, but there's not really like an intentional, space, time and space to pour into kids and to allow them to just uncover more of who they are. And we had these incredible conversations about how our own growth personally as adults had come from going through life's challenges, building our own resilience, discovering more of who we are just through going through life. And so we just started thinking, like, what would happen? Like, wouldn't that be incredible if we could create time and space for kids to safely start exploring themselves early on, instead of like when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, And so that was the beginning, this little spark of what became Maracujá, which is now a character-driven education program that we started in Brazil. I continued in Belgium, and now it's in a few international schools, some schools here stateside. And it's just powerful. I mean, I could talk about Maracujá forever because it's my baby. It's my heart. It's basically a time and space for kids to explore their identity, to explore their inner workings. We do a lot of work around just, helping them to understand what their underlying strengths are that may be covered right now in insecurities or fear. Just like I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of times where our strengths are very deep underneath something that we think is our weakness. So we do a lot of this work and have these conversations with kids. And then they do this through the lens of passion learning. So they are exploring different things that they're curious about, that they're interested in. And so it's life-changing. They might be exploring music, they might be building a website, they might be exploring entrepreneurship, fashion design. We've seen like just some of the most incredible things during Maracujá. But at the very core of it all, at the foundation, is the character development piece. So always coming back to what they're learning about themselves, how they see themselves growing, how they see their strengths being used to impact the world and their community around them. And, just putting it into the hands of the students, like giving them the opportunity to explore themselves. We had this one kid who said one time, he's like, Maracujá it gives me an opportunity to study an academic subject, and that subject is me. And it was just really impactful to us because we're like, that's so true. Like we spend most of our day, pouring into them in academically, math, writing, reading, science, all the stuff. But this is an opportunity for them to I want to study me, like who am I and how do I work? How do I interact with others? And how do I celebrate others? How do I celebrate myself? How do I build resilience? Like when challenges come. And it's incredibly powerful. I'm going to stop there because I honestly could talk about it nonstop. I love it. I love it. It's my heart.
So Maracujá, it sounds very much like an exploratory framework
Yeah.
where nothing's really set in stone. It's very much dictated by whatever passions the students gravitate towards. So really you're just exposing them to different things, and then really it's up to the student to determine, well, what am I most passionate about? What best defines who I am based on my
Hmm.
interests? So they're pretty much taking inventory as they're exploring um these different pastimes, these different activities that are set in front of them. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, yeah. So you know, I when we first created Maracujá, I really did start as a passion learning program. We wanted to explore, give them opportunities to explore different curiosities and passions. But very quickly, it evolved to it being way more about the character piece. And so now I tend to kind of move away from the term passion learning um, because I just think sometimes as educators, as the adults, especially, we kind of lock into like, oh, okay, so if they're learning, you know, for example, if a kid is exploring guitar, then it gives me a framework to where I can kind of guide him, and I can kind of, you know, I don't think you intentionally as an educator say I want to control the kid, but you have this need for like I want to keep things nicely structured so that there at the end I can see some kind of outcome. Like there's can he play these chords? Can he, you know, strung these, you know, different patterns? And really, that at the core of the program, it's more so about at at the end, can he talk about who he is? Can he share his strengths? Can he talk about his weaknesses? Has he built character strengths? You know, resilience, patience, time management, communication, working with others. Some of those pieces, those 21st century skills, and then how is he going to learn those things? Well, we're not going to do these cold, you know, isolated lessons on this is how you learn resilience. No, we're actually going to give an opportunity, the time and space to build time management, patience, resilience, all the things. And that time and space, we're using this opportunity to explore passions because they are very closely intertwined. You know, your passions, the things you naturally gravitate towards, and then your strengths, your character, who you are. And so we through the program we found this beautiful way to kind of merge the two and give kids an opportunity to explore different curiosities. We tell them this isn't something that you're committing the rest of your life to. You're exploring different things, but the main thing that we want you to walk away with at the end is being able to really communicate more about who you are and to just know, to have that inner strength and that inner, you know, foundation of this is I know who I am. I know how I react when things don't go my way. I know how to problem solve around that. Um, and so yeah, so it's I would say it's a beautiful blend of both. It's the exploring the passions and the curiosities, but always coming back to like, and who does that say? You know, what does that say about who I am? You know, so that's the foundation of the whole program.
So as you're describing the program, I'm thinking about a term that we hear so often in our education circles, and you're probably familiar with it as well. We hear about metacognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much if you're a teacher and you've been through a traditional teaching program, you had to have heard the word metacognition at least once in your life. You've probably seen it in your teacher licensure test. I'm pretty sure you have, right? So whenever we hear that word metacognition, it's always about this concept of getting students to know how they learn, how they process information.
Mm-hmm.
But with Maracujá, it sounds so much deeper than that. You're taking it to another level because now it's more about how do I problem solve, right? Um, how do I navigate these different situations? And these are things that aren't necessarily academic. These are things that you're not going to get assessed on any test.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are life skills that are going to translate into adulthood and beyond
Yeah.
that we so often overlook in our curriculum. So, you know, when we talk about this idea of social emotional learning, right, SEL, you're really tapping into that piece
Mm-hmm.
of the pie, because that's the part that we're fighting for as we speak, with everything
Yeah.
going on, particularly in our country. So I'm interested in knowing from you, how does the Maracujá program help to counter a lot of the negative things that are happening in our education world, whether it's with the books being banned, whether it's the anti-CRT rhetoric, and some of the other forces that are being imposed in our school environments?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always say when I use the analogy of you can't ask someone to give someone else, you can't ask this child to give food to another child if they themselves are starving. And so to me, the journey of digging deep into identity and giving kids the opportunity to explore themselves first is really powerful, because what I've seen, we've been doing this now for 12 years, 10 years. We started 2013. So yeah, almost 10 years. Um, and the evidence is it's just so clear and so like profound. The evidence is that when kids really have the opportunity to understand more of who they are, the the pillars of strength that they have around their confidence, around their own identity, their strengths, all of those things are so secure, and it then spills over into all other areas. So, you know, when you say we're not assessed necessarily in these skills, in some ways it's true. Like we don't have a paper, pencil, or computer generated test on these skills necessarily, but you really are like in life, you are assessed on these skills. Like if you can't problem solve, you are, it's going to be a difficult journey for you. If you cannot communicate, if you don't have the skills to hear feedback, if you don't have time management, patience, resilience, it is going to affect every other area in your life. And so giving the kids an opportunity to build these skills, then it does pour into all the other academic areas. When people are worried, like, okay, this is going to take time away from the academics, actually it adds to the 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 goodness, I would say, of all the other academic areas. Because when you start seeing kids building these skills, and then you're moving into, let's say, math, for example, you see a child struggling with something, and then you start seeing them, because of they've been building their metacognition skills, they start doing maybe some self-talk, or they remember, like, well, during Maracujá, I was faced with this challenge, and this is how I reacted, and I tried this, and I communicated like this. So maybe I can try that now in math when I'm having this challenge here. So you see it pouring into the other academic areas. You see it pouring into the community of the classroom culture and the school culture, because the more I know of who I am, and I'm secure in my strengths, the areas that I'm still growing, the more I'm able to celebrate who you are. And I'm not threatened by who you are. I'm not threatened by your strengths. I don't need to make light of your vulnerabilities, because I also have touched some of my vulnerabilities. So when I see you in a vulnerable place, in an area of your own personal growth, I can then support you. I can, I have skills to now say, I want to support you. And when you are shining, I want to celebrate you. And so when we start talking about the other issues, racism, the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, the many, many, many things that we're facing in education right now, um, to me, it always comes back down to, like, we need to give kids the opportunity to know who they are, to explore their own identity. Of course, we can surround them with books and lessons and examples. All of that is really important, but really the strength comes from kids knowing more of just who they are, and knowing their own strengths, their own abilities, and then from there being able to wholeheartedly celebrate someone else, you know. So to me, this work, or this SEL work, the work around, digging deep into emotions, understanding the power of what your emotions can do for you, how they are tools. They're not weapons that damage your, control your life, or they're not a sign of weakness, but your emotions are actually signs and symptoms of what's going on internally. When you can learn that, you can pay attention to that, you're better equipped to be a productive, positive impact in the world. And that, like I said, it really does impact all other areas. I can celebrate you when I know who I am.
Mm. Mm. Wow.
Does that make, do you hear what I'm saying? Like, it's just, I can't expect you to celebrate me culturally if you have no idea who you are. I can't expect you to support me when I'm going through a moment where I'm very clearly displaying my weakness, or this is an area of my growth. If you've never been in a place where you've had to look internally at some of your weaknesses, and oh man, she's probably feeling this way. She's probably thinking this. So this is because I did. And so I want to support her,
This is perfect because it's going to lead right into my next question. So up until this point, we've been talking about how Maracujá works from the student perspective. I'm wondering if you have a Maracujá program for teachers who want to learn more about themselves and how they function so they can better serve their students.
Well, I love that you asked a spontaneous question and put me on the spot because I actually just recently announced that I'm going to be putting out an education course, a course for educators this coming fall. If all goes well with the timeline and everything, that's my heart. It really is. My heart is just, it's kids, it's educators, it's, just people having the opportunity to discover who they are and to discover their own strengths, their purpose, their impact. And it really came out of a place of having gone to many schools now and doing some of the training around Maracujá for kids. Essentially I'm working with the adults though. I'm working with the teachers, the school leadership, the parents. I love working with the parents, because they give you such a beautiful insight to who the kids are anyways. And what I was seeing again was consistently across the board in all these different, school settings, was this need for the educators and the adults to have a chance to do some of that work themselves. Because as I would be guiding them through some of the steps that the kids were going to take, some of the activities that the kids would do, some of the questioning that the kids were going to be partaking in, it always came back to, I would have educators leaving this training session in tears, literally, or coming up to me during the break in tears, just saying like, I feel like I needed this. Man, like what would this, I keep imagining what would have happened if I had this as a kid. But even now as an adult, I've had educators talking to me about just fears and anxieties and their own insecurities. And we've all been there. I'm no different. I just shared with you, just some of the ways that insecurity has, essentially started, wanted to rob me of my ability to live my life fully. And so if I can do anything to help other educators, adults, parents to uncover their own strengths as well as they guide these kids, then that's incredible. So this fall is when I will be launching a course specifically for, right now I'm limiting it to educators who are going to be working with kids, not necessarily even with Maracujá, but just educators, because I think the thing, and I'm sure you can probably relate, Kwame, is as educators, we're always pouring out. We're always giving. That's our role, and that's
all
our
the time.
heart.
We're selfless.
And the thing is, we are celebrated. The accolades that come to us when we pour out and we give, and we are exhausted. The more exhausted, the better you must be, And I my own personal journey with that has been, you can literally pour so much out and run just on fumes to the point where eventually my body physically had started shutting down. And I was, in a doctor's office being told, like, you need to make some major changes. Otherwise, this is really going to take over your life. And it was because I was just obsessively, and again, it's like I say, every strength, it can be turned into a weakness, if you're not careful. And so I had obsessively been someone who was pouring out and giving and doing as much as I could to impact others, and not ever taking time to pour into myself, and not ever taking time to sit with who is Rebekah? What is she going through? What are, what's happening in her life? What is her purpose? And so to be able to pour into myself, when I started to do that, the healing that it brought me literally like it just fueled me to be someone who could pour out and give even more, because I had to fill up. And
There you go.
so for me, like, to be able to work with educators and say, like, hey, we all know this isn't easy. We are like, there's just, let's not even get into COVID and just all the impact that that's had, especially for teachers working abroad, away from families, not sure when they might get home. Like, when am I going to see the people that I love? All the uncertainties that has brought as well, and then to be someone who's like, but I still have to be a strong support to my students.
Yep.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And so to be able to pour back into those individuals, I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to it, because, that's my heart.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. I got one more question. And just as a disclaimer, I did not give you this question, but it just popped into my mind as we were having this very organic conversation. And this is what tends to happen when good conversation happens, right? So 3 P's are coming to my mind: privilege, positionality, power,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason why I mentioned these 3 P's is because, as being an educator who's all about creating spaces of belonging that are diverse, that are inclusive, that are equitable, we have to have an awareness, a consistent awareness of those 3 P's in every space we occupy, including the classroom. So I'm interested in knowing how Maracujá allows for educators to keep that reminder at top of mind as they engage with students and do this important work.
Yeah. Well, what you're bringing up is such a good point, because that's something that's evident all the time. Like, we're always thinking about, and I think especially if you come from a marginalized group yourself, then you are filtering things through that lens of, okay, how am I presenting things in a way that is accessible to all students? Because I know what it's like to be on the other end, where I don't know if I have access, or if I have the privilege or the right positionality, or the positions of power. So if I've been in those places, I filter everything that I do through that lens, and what I'm teaching and what I'm doing. And it's specifically in Maracujá, I think one of the things that's really impactful is that we've created the program to be where it should like, the goal is that it's not something that should only work in schools that have an incredible amount of resources and access to opportunities. But it's literally, since it's a character development program, it's something that we want to make sure that is accessible to students, no matter what the school resources are, what the family's resources are, the languages, any of that. And so a lot of the background work for the teachers, the educators, is really going into looking beyond some of those things of privilege and positions of power, and no matter what, like, looking into the identity of each child, and to giving kids the ability to look into themselves beyond the surface level things, or the the external factors that are in play. And so some of the work we do with the educators has evolved into exploring that for them as well. Like, what are some of the places of privilege that you've had that has affected how you carry out your curriculum, how you maybe even view or speak to or interact with some of the students, and to do some inner reflecting and to be bold enough and brave enough to go into some of those vulnerable places where you realize, like, okay, like this is an area for me that I didn't even realize I have a bias. I have a bias in this area. And I've had that plenty of times. I still encounter those things in my life. And I think we always should be uncovering new layers of, okay, this is something I've been thinking, even just like subconsciously, I have these ideas and these views, and I want to go dig deeper into that and understand, like, where is this coming from? How is this serving me? Is it serving me? And what do I do if I recognize I need to change these thought patterns, change, my view on things, and finding that inner strength to do that, because it isn't always easy to be able to reflect and say, like, okay, I didn't realize I had privilege in this area. I didn't realize I had a position of power, or that I had a bias that was affecting the way I interacted with my students. And
Right.
that can be a scary thing. It can be a really scary thing, especially as an educator, as a school leader, to look and say, like, maybe some of my systems that are in practice have benefited me because that's how I function and that's how I grew up. But maybe I can relook at things, and I can still be okay, because it goes back to, like, the change piece. Can I be okay with change? Like, can I be okay that some of my students, need something differently than what I would have needed, or their background is different than what my background was?
Right.
Can I learn to communicate in different ways? And so I think all of that comes back to, like, that inner core and that inner resilience that we can build as educators.
Yes. Yes. Very much so. But Rebekah, we're actually at the hour, and
Oh my
we've had such
gosh,
a great conversation. See how quickly that goes?
it's crazy.
It's just
Like,
like
we're just,
that.
like, just
Just like
chatting.
that. I, that's what I
I
was trying to
loved it.
tell you. That's what I was trying to tell you. That's why you have nothing to be nervous about. We just talked about what you do. That's all we did for an hour. And look how quickly time went.
Oh man, I love
So
it.
so to wrap us up, we're gonna do a quick lightning round.
Oh man.
We're at the
Okay.
home stretch, so I have a few quick hitter questions to close us out. First question I love to ask my guest is to tell me what their favorite self-care activity is. So what is it for you?
Oh my gosh. Favorite self-care activity, I would honestly say, is meditating. And that
Mm,
doesn't always look the same. It's just taking time away from whatever it is going on around me to quiet myself. And I can do that literally in a crowd of thousands, like, to find the inner quietness within myself and to just start reflecting, to start thinking about where I'm at, what's going on, how I'm feeling about things. I do a lot of inner self-talk, just like, how are you doing, girl? Like, what's going on? And I've found that to be the most um, powerful self-care activity, because I'm just like, I'm checking in with myself like I would with any other best friend. I would check in just to see how I'm doing, and then from there I know what to do. Like, if I feel myself saying, like, I just really need some alone time, or I just really need to have some quality friendship time, or I need music, whatever it might be, I can tap into it because I check in with myself. You know.
nice. And when you enter a classroom, doesn't have to be your classroom, just any classroom in general. What would be your walk-in song?
My walk-in song. Um. Oh man. Like, I want to think. I'm thinking of the Sia song, but I can't remember the name right now. Great. You can something about greatness, but basically,
Mm,
like, the freedom to be great. I can't think of the lyrics right now, but the freedom to be great, the freedom to fly, the freedom to be who you are. But it's just a really upbeat song, and the lyrics, particular, are just very powerful in the sense of like, be great, like don't ask permission to be who you are, just be, you know. So I
And
would say
that
probably
line,
that's my song, because I want to bring that energy into classrooms, and I want that to infuse the kids. I want them to have that same message within themselves. Like, you don't need to ask permission. Just be great.
boom. And that's right in the spirit of Maracujá.
Yes,
There you go. I see what
absolutely.
you're doing with that. I see what you're doing with that. All right. If you could invite three influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be?
Um, well, three influential figures to dinner. I would love, honestly, and I'm just going off the top of my head right now. Um,
That's fine.
I honestly would love to sit down with some of my ancestors that I didn't get to meet. Um, and just to have, like, some deep conversations about who they are. I would say, on both sides, my parents, um, incredible speakers, writers, songwriters, musicians, like just really game changers. And I've heard lots of stories about them, my grandparents, great grandparents. And I would love to have a dinner where I could just sit down and talk to them about how they got into what they were doing, how they view the world, their dreams and desires for their future generations, which would be me, and just to hear their hearts around things, because I love those conversations that I have. I'm super blessed to have those kind of conversations with my parents now. They're both in their 80s, and I just learned so much. So I think it would just be incredible to maybe even go further beyond that and just, have some of these heartfelt conversations with ancestors, you know.
Mm, I hear that. Well, Rebekah, well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. This has been awesome.
Oh my
But
gosh.
before you log off, how can people get in touch with you so they can learn more about the Maracujá program? So if you have any social media handles or even a website they could visit, this is the time to let them know.
Yes. Well, my Instagram handle is at Rebekah Macden, and it's Rebecca with a KAH, so REBEKAHMACDEN. So at Rebekah Macden, same for LinkedIn and Twitter, Rebekah Macden. My website is also RebekahMacden.com. I also have an Instagram handle specifically for Maracujá, and that's Maracujá Passion Learning, I believe. I should know this off the top of my head, but Maracujá, you can find us there. But yeah, I would love to be in contact if you are hearing this podcast, this incredible podcast by Kwame. I would love to be in touch with you if you're interested in hearing more about the program or my work with schools. And I just love connecting. So I just send me a message, let me know how we can connect. And I want to thank you, Kwame, because this has been such an honor, such a privilege to be able to be here on the podcast with you, to connect around things that
Yes.
we're both so passionate about. And yeah, just thank you so much for the work that you're doing, the way you're impacting so many people through just taking the steps, like, the risk to put yourself out there, to put amazing content out there, to connect people. It's such an honor. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for just being you and for doing what you do. And if I'm going to be transparent, I still have days where I doubt myself.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
still days where I still have to remind myself of who I am and how far I've come. So the
Hmm.
work is something that is ongoing and there's no end to it. It's a marathon. We're
Yeah.
still learning things about ourselves that we didn't learn the day before or the day before that. That's just how the process is, as you know very well.
Yeah. I think that's, just real quick, what you're saying, it reminds me of something we had talked about earlier, which is, you're always on this journey. And we sometimes see the finished product of someone and we're like, dang, they really have it together. Like they must be here and I'm only back here. But the truth is, like, we all have these moments of doubt, of questioning our identity, our purpose. We
Yes.
have these moments of fear that maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should have done this. Maybe I should have done, like, just second guessing. And just the power of all of that is to know, like, you're not alone. And as long as every day you're saying, okay, I need to realign myself with what my purpose is and who I am, like, the impact is powerful. It's great. So we're all here. We're all on this journey.
Oh, we're all on this journey.
Yeah.
All right, Rebekah. So we might have to do a part two. I know we're going to be having conversations off the air, but as far as the podcast itself, or even maybe even in the future, we might have to do some kind of collab, because even as we're talking, I sense some parallels. I know you sense them too. I sense the
Yeah.
vibe.
Absolutely. I would love that. So, and don't think that I didn't already think about that. So,
Of course, of course. So we'll definitely talk more about that.
for
But
sure.
I want to wish you a good rest of the day. I think you're off for the summer. School
Yep.
year's over, right?
Yep.
So I definitely want to wish you a good summer vacation if we
Yeah.
don't connect again during these next couple months. And just keep on pushing. Looking forward to
Oh,
see what Maracujá looks like in the fall.
thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. All right, people. So we're about to end another fantastic episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I'm wishing you all a good morning, good afternoon, and good night wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.